I'm Aisha. You can now watch UCF TV 24 hours a day on Bright House Digital Channel 1.
Governor Christ has announced really the largest single real estate environmental transaction in the history of Florida. It is of monumental proportions. We have agreed in principle, statement of principles with U.S. Sugar to purchase, but we don't have a contract. We have a non-binding set of statement of principles, and we are now in the midst of negotiating. And as you can imagine, this is a very complicated negotiation. We've been working very diligently for a number of months now to hopefully bring a solid contract to our board. We have had a very open and transparent public process. As my two colleagues on the panel will tell you, land acquisition is one of those few things that you in government have to hold some things close to your vest, because as any sort of land transaction transpires, you don't want the other side to know what you think their property is worth. It's just like going in to buy a house. You negotiate. So we feel like we've opened this up very broadly to the public very early, and are trying to do this as completely as transparent as possible. To zoom in a little bit on the satellite image that Michael showed you, this is Lake Okeechobee. It is the second largest freshwater lake wholly in the United States. Trick question. Lake Michigan's bigger. The other Great Lakes are bigger, but they share common waters with international waters with Canada. And also the Great Salt Lake is bigger, but it's a salt lake. So Lake Okeechobee is roughly 740 square miles. This is the area to the south, which is the Everglades agricultural area. The tanned and colored areas are areas that are owned actually by U.S. Sugar. It's roughly 187,000 acres of real estate and other assets. Of the 187,000 acres, to kind of put this in perspective, it's roughly 292 square miles. That's larger than the city of Chicago. I'm a Southern boy, so that doesn't mean much to me. To put it in perspective, it's about 8 times larger than the city limits of Fort Lauderdale. So it's a very, very large area. It has about 150,000 acres of sugarcane and about 32,000 acres of citrus. Those citrus lands hold 2.1 million trees that can produce more than 7 million boxes of Valencia and Hamlin oranges each season. And that's enough for 42 million gallons of juice. We also, it's an all or nothing deal with U.S. Sugar. We either purchase all of their assets, but not their company. We're purchasing their assets, and they needed to sell either all or nothing, and I can explain that a little bit better. But they also would sell their sugar mill. This sugar mill was built in 1926 by the Southern Sugar Company, and it's actually was rebuilt from an old mill down at the Pensuco, the Pennsylvania Sugar Company, which is Bob Graham's family down in Miami, was brought up to this area and put back together. It's been completely renovated in 2007. It has the capacity to grind up to 4,000 tons of sugar cane each harvest season, and that results in about 6 million tons of raw sugar each year. Another asset we would acquire is their sugar refinery. It was commissioned in 1998. It's supplied by sugar from their own mill, produces about 600,000 tons of sugar annually. It's about 12 stories tall, 300,000 square feet. It includes the refining, packaging, and warehouse operations. They package over 50 private labels. Probably the one most of you are familiar with is they provide the sugar to Publix, amongst others. Their citrus processing plant, this is the Southern Garden Citrus Processing Plant. It's in Hendry County on the edge of the Everglades. It has the capacity to process 2 million boxes of oranges in a season. About 120 million gallons of juice is produced annually, and They have 59 1 million gallon, you can see that in the lower right-hand corner, very large cold storage tanks not for concentrate orange juice. Another asset that we would be acquiring is their railroad. They have over 220 miles of railroad, most of that owned, but about 62 miles is leased. It extends from Sebring to Fort Pierce around the southern rim of Lake Okeechobee. They also have over 1,000 railroad cane cars and over 29 locomotives. We'd also be acquiring their rolling assets, their passenger vehicles, trucks, tractors, harvesters, equipment, about 1,800 vehicles in total. And then other assets include their other buildings and structures, about 90 different non-processing buildings, their administrative buildings, office buildings, maintenance and storage buildings as well. So this is a massive undertaking for government. So we put together a due diligence team to make sure that what we're doing is good for the taxpayers of the state of Florida. Equally as more important is it's good for the Everglades and the restoration plan. We're doing appraisals following the market value, the Uniform Standard of Professional Appraisal Practices. You can imagine appraising these assets is quite an undertaking. We also have to do environmental assessments. These lands, as Michael talked about, they've been farmed in one form or the other since the original levees were put around Lake Okeechobee at the turn of the last century, and some of their rudimentary ditches were dug. So over that period of time, well over a century, they've had pesticides, herbicides, farming practices that were commonplace 50 years ago would not be acceptable today. So we have to make sure they're not things hidden in the soils that might cause problems for the restoration. Massive amount of data collection to do these environmental assessments. At some point, we've had over 60 employees in the field full time. They're assessing site samples of over 12,000 soil samples and over 500 water samples. We also have to look at the quality because we're buying physical assets. So we're doing engineering analysis and the condition of all these assets we're acquiring. Have they been well maintained? Are they operating properly? Is it an asset that we can then get our money back out of by surplusing for a third party who may want to put it to use? So quite a bit of actually the documentation of all those assets. And as I mentioned, all the vehicles and the equipment that we're purchasing, we have to do inventory and management control of those assets as well. So we also are doing a lot to ensure that the public trust, is protected, that we are being fiduciarily responsible with this large amount of taxpayers' dollars. So we're doing something that's never been done by a state agency. We're actually doing a fairness opinion. It's very much typical of Fortune 500 asset takeovers. This is essentially comparable to that. What a fairness opinion does on a corporate level is it makes sure that the stockholders are getting a fair value if a company buys another company. We're doing this to make sure the taxpayers are getting a good price. So there will be very little room for argument that we've paid too much or have not been fiduciarily responsible for that. And lastly, on the financial framework, and this is where I know you'll appreciate since we started this endeavor, there's been a lot of things happening on the stock market, the bond market, which adds a little bit of additional diligence. We need to make sure that the money will be available. But we don't have $2 billion just sitting there. So the way that we would be able to fund this and have the capacity to fund it is through what we call certificates of participation, or going to Wall Street and issuing bonds on the bond market. We will make sure that we can sell and market and have viable and stable bonds before we go forward. The way we're able to generate this much bond revenues or proceeds is that we have the Water Management District is funded by property tax, ad valorem tax. We are fortunate that we have 16 counties. We have a very large tax base. We have some of the wealthiest counties in the state, some of the highest value real estate in the state. So an individual taxpayer may only pay about $200 a year to the South Florida Water Management District, but when you multiply that across the 16 counties from Orlando all the way to the Keys, it generates about $522 million per year. So that would be the revenue source that we would use to pay back those the certificates of participation. I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly to kind of reiterate a few of the things that Michael talked about very eloquently. This is really explaining graphically what he was telling you in the wonderful narrative that he used to explain the system. Pre-man, Lake Okeechobee would overflow much like just exactly like he said, spill over from the south. The lake, as I mentioned, 740 square miles. It used to get as big as 1,100 square miles. The lake would expand to 1.5 times its size. It would spill over, created this beautiful sawgrass plain to the south. There was a sort of a natural levee on the south that was pond apple trees. It would spill over that and flow and slowly make its way south. As you'll see, about 100% of the water either evaporated or flowed to the south. Today, there's a huge disconnect. There's a hole between the lake and the Kissimmee River in Orlando and the Everglades. And as we developed all these restoration plans, that was private property, unwilling sellers. We had to design around them. What U.S. Sugar's willingness to sell as a voluntary seller has given us is a chance to make the future Everglades look a little bit more like the one to the left as it is to the right. As you'll see in the existing Everglades, the ponding depths are too deep in two places, too shallow in others, and essentially you have an entire ecosystem that's starved of water. This kind of schematic kind of shows it best. I mentioned 100% of the water pre-drainage flowed east and west. Now, about 19% of the water that leaves Lake Okeechobee is consumed by the growers of the Everglades agricultural area for irrigation, and the remaining 80% is artificially shunted east and west. That's about 2 million acre-feet of water a year. An acre-foot of water is just a foot of water over an acre of land. If you do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, what that means, that's about 1.7 billion gallons of water per day that used to stay in the system, flow from the lake, southward, make its way through the Everglades, now artificially gets shunted out to tide. And that is, kills the estuaries downstream, and it starves the Everglades of very, very needed water. So very little water makes its way through the Everglades to Florida Bay now. So what this project does is it gives us this opportunity to deliver cleaner water to the Everglades by building the storage and the treatment that Michael was talking about. We would no longer have to back pump water when it rained in those farmlands back into the Everglades. And it would also, what the Everglades agricultural area that's not purchased, that's left behind, we believe would have a more sustainable future. What we really need is about 1 million acre-feet of storage below the lake and about 1 million acre-feet of storage above the lake. That would take care of that 2 million acre-feet that's artificially shunted out to tide. We believe that this will give us the chance to do that. You know, one logical question most people, the uninitiated, would ask, why don't you just put more water in Lake Okeechobee? Well, first of all, that's a beautiful lake that has its own ecological value. So if you just stacked water up in it for long periods of time, you kill the lake. It becomes very stagnant. It drowns all the emergent vegetation. We need somewhere else to store water. And this will give us the opportunity to meet that 1 million acre-feet of storage south of the lake. So what are some of the issues? Michael touched on some of them. We think the opportunities are this additional storage and treatment. Some of the issues are we do have very drastic conditions south of the lake. The topography has changed. The soil has subsided. We have areas that are 10 feet lower than they used to be south of the lake, where Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades actually sit higher than this farmland in between in many places. But we think we can manage water with this real estate in a way that can mimic the natural system, hold that water to the north during the wet season, move it down back through the Everglades during the dry season when it needs it. And we have some existing facilities. There's infrastructure, there's roads, there's railroads, there's processing facilities, but we're going to be able to design the restoration project that takes these things into consideration, and we believe we can work around them. Lastly, I'm going to kind of close up really quickly. This is our good fortune, the southern end of the Everglades agricultural area. Reorient yourself, Lake Okeechobee, the farmland in the middle, the remnant Everglades to the south. We already own this this assemblage of land. We've built stormwater treatment areas you see in the lighter shaded green. We have additional areas that we purchased for storage and treatment on the old Talisman. It was the old St. Joe Paper Company, Talisman, a subsidiary we bought in 1998. And then we had some existing remnant natural areas, the Holy Land Rotenberger areas that are wildlife management areas on the southern end. So we already own sort of a swath of the bottom tier of the Everglades agricultural area. So one conceptual thing would be to take all this land as much as we could and consolidate ownership and create sort of a connected area between the lake back to the Everglades. Unfortunately, there's some obstructions that are in the way. Highway 27, the railroad, the Okeelana, the Fonhools that were mentioned, they're processing plants in that way. So another potential conceptual way is to engineer around them. Do land exchanges and swaps, consolidate, use that real estate footprint that we have to trade with adjacent landowners, use that asset of the mill that we will not keep, the citrus processing plant, generate those revenues to assemble something that might look like this. And yet a third option would be to just use the lands we're getting and use the existing canals and improvements to those canals to store the water to the north and treat it to the south. And the reason I wanted to share these very cartoonish sort of potential designs for restoration is to show you the incredible flexibility of having that real estate footprint gives us. If we can have third parties who come to the table and will do exchanges with us to consolidate ownership, that would be perfect and ideal. If we can't, this is still a very wise purchase because it gives us that ability to store that 1 million acre feet of water and treat that 1 million acre feet of water and send that 1 million acre feet of water back through the Everglades and no longer discharge it east and west through the Everglades. One of the original Everglades restoration components were these aquifer storage and recovery wells. 1.5 million gallons a day. There were 300 wells, 5 million gallons apiece per day capacity. Simple back of the envelope calculation. If you have this real estate to store the water on instead of injecting it underground with all the uncertainty that that has, we believe you can accomplish the same outcome and virtually eliminate those catastrophic releases of too much fresh water to the coast at the wrong times in the wrong places and send that water south again. One performance measure we used was how frequently does that happen today? It happens about 1 every 3 years. And that's unacceptable. We dump too much water in the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie estuary that would cause harm to those ecosystems. With this real estate footprint, we believe that that could be pretty much knocked down to maybe a 1 or a 2 in 30-year occurrence, if at all. So we think that will eliminate those the needs for that. So with that, I'll be glad to wrap up and hand it over to the next speaker.
So the Nature Conservancy has been working in the Everglades watershed. We've helped protect 355,000 acres, and we've worked with a number of counties to pass bond referendums so that key counties can use their monies to purchase additional lands. We've also brought our expertise in terms of land management and there we go, and helped to establish a public-private partnership to work on invasive species. That's a cooperative weed management area in South Florida. But really the primary efforts of the Nature Conservancy have been in the northern Everglades watershed area, and I would say our Disney Wilderness Preserve, which is at the headwaters, is really a great example of restoration, and we're finishing that project up, and it's a real showcase of how lands can be successfully restored. And we're also excited that we have about 100,000 acres of land, of ranch lands, that of folks that are interested in protecting their lands in the northern Everglades area. So if we can find the acquisition programs that would be able to bring the funding to the table, then we're hopeful that we can protect those lands and really begin to clean up the water and hold more water in the northern Everglades area. So that's a summary of what the Nature Conservancy's been doing.
Well, you know, the story of the latest chapter in the Everglades restoration really goes back to the early 1990s, 1991, 1992, and 1993. And in the incipient days of Everglades restoration, the scientists got together and began to hatch their own plan as to what really ought to be done to restore the Everglades. And they actually had the initiative and the authorization, at least in the beginning, to publish that in a series of papers that were described and titled as the Science Subgroup Plan, back when the Army Corps of Engineers was first authorized by the Congress to restudy what had been done in the Everglades. And interestingly enough, what the scientists recommended when they had their own hand in it before political forces began to intervene was that a large part of the Everglades agricultural area needed to be reclaimed for conservation and transcended away from sugarcane fields and vegetable fields and moved into water storage and water management to help revitalize the Everglades system. In spite of everything that's happened to the Everglades, if you look at those pictures we've just been treated to, both by Michael and by Ernie, you can see that although the system has shrunken, the reality is that the path of the Everglades from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay is largely intact, but for one segment. And that one segment, of course, is that 700,000 acre area known as the Everglades agricultural area, about 400,000 acres of which is in sugarcane. The opportunity to acquire the U.S. sugar lands is not something that has happened by accident. It has happened by what I would describe as economic evolution. Back in the days when those scientists had the courage, or perhaps the naivete, to put their ideas on paper, the reaction from the sugar industry and its political allies was immediate, swift, and brutal. And as a matter of fact, if you go back to that science subgroup report and follow the careers, or perhaps the lack of them, of those scientists after that publication was made, it was tragic the degree to which the weight of political opposition put its hand on the careers of those scientists. Some of them were transferred to South Dakota. Some of them were literally drummed out of the agencies they worked for. Others took early retirement. A few of them survived. But the reality was that the legion of lobbyists that the sugar industry deployed was capable of crushing that idea. And so the Everglades restoration, as it evolved beyond the initial opinion of the scientists, was really a series of workarounds. And people were forced to say, well, how do we restore the Everglades if we can't do the thing we really want to do, which is to reclaim a lot of that 500,000 to 700,000 acres south of the lake as area that could be restored to useful water storage and water management for the system. So since that time, virtually everything that has been done, perhaps outside of the Kissimmee restoration north of the lake, has been a more poor second choice to what we really wanted to do. And now, because the sugar industry has evolved due to the effects of GATT and NAFTA and the fact that the international community is forcing a more fair trade policy on the United States, the U.S. Sugar Corporation, in years just before the possibility of this deal was announced, for all of its billions of dollars of infrastructure, its thousands and thousands of employees, was only making about a $3 million per year profit, which was a tiny amount for a huge corporation. And so the industry is moving to the point where it was ready to consider a deal like this that it would not have been willing to consider 10 or 15 years ago. The danger in the Everglades agricultural area is that other events will move past us and obscure the possibility of these lands coming into public use as water storage and water management areas. We know, for example, that Florida crystals and the Fanjul's have a very aggressive outlook on what should happen to that land for their own purposes. And that aggressive outlook is they would like to see much of that land turned into what might be described as South Florida's version of the Los Angeles Valley. We all know the story of the Los Angeles Valley and what happened there to that farmland, which was turned into residential and commercial and city development as the agriculture faded away. So we hope that the U.S. sugar deal in some form goes through. The final thing I'd like to say is about the greater Everglades system, and it kind of resonates with something that was stated by Tricia Martin just a few minutes ago. The other challenge, once we can gain a foothold on water storage in the agricultural area itself, that I think remains as the biggest challenge for the Everglades, is really close to home for us here in the Orlando area. And that is the upper Kissimmee Valley, particularly the part of the Kissimmee just south of the city of Kissimmee in Orlando and Osceola County that is heavily challenged by development pressure, but actually running all the way south to Lake Okeechobee. We have over 1.5 million acres in that drainage, 90% of which, even considering the development that's taken place, 90% of which remains either in native habitat or in agriculture. And we think it's there that the water management future for the system also lies, in addition to the Everglades agricultural area. So millions of acre feet of water that used to be stored in the Kissimmee like a sponge is now rapidly shooting every time it rains down those canals toward the C-38 canal. Fortunately, a good part of that is going to be restored by the Kissimmee Restoration Program, but nonetheless potentially overpowering the restored river and shooting those waters directly toward Lake Okeechobee. We've got to gain a foothold in the upper Kissimmee. We've got to find a way to reach back into that lattice work of canals and to engineer and install more modern water control structures that'll stair-step that water up and begin to store it again in much the same way as it used to be stored in that Kissimmee system. If you drive through the area, a classic picture that sticks in my mind is a trip I took on a piece of land near Yeehaw Junction about a year ago. And we drove down through the bottom. This was during the wet season. We drove down through the bottom of a great ditch and up to the top of the other side of the ditch in a four-wheel drive vehicle. And at the top of the ditch, at least 15 feet above where the water was, where the wheels of our Jeep went through, that was where the cypress trees were growing, 15 feet above our heads. And that tells you how much the water table has been depressed by those ditches, which we could regain if we were to put water control structures back into that system. If we could find a way economically to work with the farmers who own the land in that region to make it worth their while, if you will, for them to literally farm water for the rest of the population of Florida and its natural systems, we could restore a lot without even building a single reservoir north of Lake Okeechobee. And that's one of the things that Audubon is looking at strategically as the next step in Everglades restoration. We need to gain a foothold on that system, begin to restore its water storage capacity, and we think we can do that by working with landowners, by working with the Water Management District, coming up with a plan to do that in a way that begins to preserve the natural environment at the same time we're storing water.